Good morning and welcome everybody to the British Dyslexia Association Dyslexia Commission with Curia. Thank you very much for joining, and I hope this is going to be a really productive session. Thank you very much to Ben Howlett for organising and putting all of this together and putting together three excellent panels. I'll be chairing the first session and then handing over at 11 o'clock to Gillian Ashley, who'll be chairing the remainder of the session. This was put in the diary before Her Majesty decided to give her speech today, albeit that'll be actually delivered by Prince Charles. So unfortunately, I am going to have to go and participate in that great celebration of democracy and what Parliament's going to be up to in the next year. The good news is that there is word as yet unconfirmed, but word that there will be an education bill there. And what I'd say is, in terms of where the political debate and the policy debate is up to, we are seeing progress in terms of making the argument for the need to cater to dyslexic children's needs and to make sure they get support. We're seeing progress in that argument more than I've seen in my 12 years in Parliament, and the door is very much open, but there is a huge amount more work to do in order to win the argument for what needs to happen, and then ensure that that's put in place at a policy level. My sense is that there is a groundswell coming from the ground up as well. So in the first session, we're going to talk about policy, and we're going to talk about, if you like, the national level of the work that where that progress is up to in terms of making the argument. I'll touch on that in a moment. And then we're going to look at some of the developments that are happening actually on the ground, both in terms of some of the new technologies that are coming in. We have lots of local authority and civil society and dyslexia practice experts on today. So we're going to be looking at what's actually going on in the real world. And then we're going to turn to look at the SEND review and the likely responses to the SEND review, because unlike the Queen's Speech, the SEND review has been cast very much as a consultation document for better and for worse. For better, it means that now is a very good moment to be putting in responses. For worse, because it means that we are further away from the sort of concrete action at a policy level that I know that many on this call have been looking for. If I just give an overview of where I see it from Parliament, I really refocused on this area, which I care deeply about, in the autumn, and engaged with the new Secretary of State, who has a very personal reason to care about driving up literacy. And my case to him is, you're not going to get to the sorts of levels of literacy that you want to unless you actually directly have provision for and support for dyslexic pupils. My impression is that the drive for better standards over the last decade, as many of you will know, has led to a focus more on the mainstream brain, and that but that does not cater for all ways of thinking. And I know that Nadeem Zahawi gets this. He's a good guy, and ironically, considering the subject matter, he and I have written a book together in the past. So he is receptive to this argument. The door is very much open, and I thought that the combination of the education white paper and the SEND review last month made progress in this area. But there is still an ingrained attitude of unenthusiasm about identification within the powers that be, that I think needs to be addressed. From my point of view, in the campaign that I've been running here in Parliament, we have now got commitments in terms of screening and improved data for an improvement in early identification of dyslexia and other neurodiversities. Now, I think that is good, but I'd like to see it actually what the details of that are, because a high-level commitment is not enough. We have got commitment for more teacher training, and I think there's a very widespread recognition that there isn't nearly enough teacher training, both in initial teacher training and then in ongoing CPD. But we have now the departmental position that every teacher is a teacher of a child with neurodiverse conditions. That is, again, good progress, but we're in the realms of seeing the recognition of reality, and turning that into good policy is the next stage. Following the Queen's speech today, I will be reintroducing my bill at the earliest opportunity. There's a whole load of parliamentary shenanigans that need to go on to make that happen, but it is that's in a way my skill set and my gig rather than yours. I'm incredibly grateful for all the support that I've had, both technical support to make sure we get the details of that bill right, but also broad support in making this argument, and I think that we have made some progress, and we've at least got the argument pointing in the right direction when it comes to the government level. At the same time, I'm really interested to hear the experiences on the ground. Obviously, the pandemic has been a huge moment of challenge in the entire education system, and I think it makes our mission even more important because the disruption to education will have affected dyslexic students more than most. That's my presumption from the nature of how teaching's happened over the last 2 years. If you don't find it easy already, you'll find it even harder when you've had to cope with disrupted learning. And for all the merits of technology, of which I'm a great fan and advocate, there's nothing as good as a face-to-face human teacher. So let's turn to the first panel. But what I hope that we can get out of this session today and the three panels is recommitment to this cause, to ensure that everybody gets the opportunities that they deserve, no matter how their brain is wired, and to make sure that the huge upsides of the neurodiverse brain and the dyslexic brain can be unleashed, because they are needed more than ever in the 21st century. I hope that in saying that and setting out that mission that is uncontroversial on this Zoom, I'm sure there are nuances in how we approach it, but one of the things that I've found in the time that I've been working on this subject is that re-articulating the mission and the purpose behind it is incredibly important, because there are many institutions trying to do good things in this space and many people working to do good things, and we are working to a common mission. We may have different nuances on how we get there and what the priorities are in getting there, but all of us recapitulating and setting out what we're trying to achieve, I think, is very important, because then for all the debate on how, we can make sure we get over with one voice what we're trying to achieve to those who might be skeptical of this movement. And that's so one of the things I'm trying to provide, listening to as many voices as possible, is that sort of high level mission focus, and then turning mission into reality through Parliament. And talking of Parliament, on our first panel, we have Dominic Addington, Lord Addington, President of the British Dyslexia Association. Wonderful to have you with us. I don't know if you also have to leave to go and see the Prince of Wales, but we're delighted that you're on the first panel. Gillian Ashley, of course, CEO of the BDA. You're in the trenches making this argument. And we also welcome Helen Ross, trustee of the BDA, to the first panel. So I'd really love to throw it over to you, Dominic, from your perspective in the House of Lords as a fellow legislator. What's your view of where things are up to, and what do we need to be pushing for next? Can I go to you first before coming to you, Gillian, next? Dominic.
Okay, well, what I'd say is, well, after hello, is the case that there is a parliamentary groundswell that actually says, yes, we should do something about this. But it's been there for a while, because everybody who has a surgery will actually have somebody going to them. Now, Matt can talk you through the delights of a surgery. I happen to have a wife who actually does this for another political party for that. But going through, but the fact that people get in and they have a chance to speak to politicians, particularly, MPs, and going through. So I would suggest we do have a way in, but it hasn't been coordinated and it hasn't registered. And parliamentarians, I mean, I got something passed in the House of Lords a couple of times, and things about better teacher training and further education recently. The great government machine chopped it up and threw it back in the end. But there is a groundswell, the fact that people are taking this seriously, and the thing they're taking seriously is the fact that not everybody else learns the same way. And Matt was absolutely right. And he said there is an obsession with standards, but it's standards for this mythical beast, the normal person. Now, I mean, there's was it Freud's quote, find me a normal person, I'll cure him. And that's just his psychology. What we've actually got to do is try and get a way that they understand there are different ways forward, and you will get better learning results. Now, this is something which I try and only get right half the time. Systematic synthetic phonics, if I've got the right name here, I'm looking at Gillian for a nod, yay, well done me, is one of those things which we've said is now the best way to teach. Doesn't work for dyslexics. We've got people in this room who will define it better, but basically short-term memory problems, I am told, is the main problem with it. You've got to get a degree of flexibility in there. And as Matt's also said here, you're talking about 90% literacy. Well done if you get there. You sure as hell won't do it unless you get wider spectrums of actually teaching and availability to us. And also something else that Matt hasn't said today so far, if we go at this as we are dyslexia and we are alone and we are special, we will get into a suffering contest with every other hidden disability and indeed every other disability sector going. We must go as a coherent group, saying down there, flexibility is in, we're included because we're the biggest group. Hey, we don't have to worry. You've got to go down there and talk to everybody else. We did a little parliamentary report. It's one of these things that sounds more important than it is. We looked about people in the workplace with dyslexia a few years ago. Half the dyslexics identify as having one of the other hidden needs, self-identify. You have the biggest group that stands by themselves, but even then there'll always be some psychologist who goes, no, you've got certain traits in there. And if you've got ADHD or attention deficit disorder without the hyperactivity or dyspraxia or dyscalculia, and you don't address all of those, you will still fail. And it's don't take the label too far and go back to the fact it's an individual person. And this is something which seems to be lacking. And actually, I would say, I hope out of this, we've got a coherent strategy that makes life difficult for MPs, because you don't get somebody railing at them in their surgeries when you contact them. And I've got a nodding head here because he's undoubtedly getting from his secretaries in the neck when they go, road people hate them, and plus an expletive or two thrown in. If you get this going down that you're coherently based and you're actually saying we're taking other people with us, we need a degree of flexibility, it opens up the door for everything else. The use of technology, the fact that classrooms don't have to have people looking at a whiteboard working at the same pace, because you won't get the best results that way. And it's trying to get this message across. Now, the current bill, mainly about academy chains. How do we work in special educational needs support on that? The long-term idea about special educational needs being a review on it. Are we being coherent in saying there's a series of supports and structures which are easier to do and cheaper and we're going out. The current system, and I was on that bill, I was fighting about dyslexics and apprenticeship qualifications at the time, so probably didn't spend enough time on it. What we actually did was we said, school, here we are, take a bunch of budget out of your mainstream and dump it on an individual pupil for themselves. I mean, and I'm hoping we get that right. If we don't do that, so much of that, and say invest in your teaching staff and your infrastructure, we may well do better. That's my, start of attempt. But there's a series of coherent arguments. We must go as much part of a big coherent group. We can't start coffin waving, effectively saying, oh, deal with us and the problems of the world go away. Or we're suffering more. We've got to be slightly more together with our friends. If we're not, we're going to get picked off. And the idea about, we don't want to identify a specialist, and the current teacher training structure, which Matt has actually already alluded to, is the one we're saying we've got to help and support everybody without saying they'll take on special things, because unless you get a coherent strategy, it sounds like everybody should take a 2-year course to become a specialist in every disability going. We're talking about infrastructure behind that, identification, what's going on, where do we come from that? That is what's required. Now, having said that, after you've done this, let's take the salt out of the Red Sea and solve every other problem on the planet. But we've got to start doing it. We've got to start getting the basic government reaction that you've got to work differently and smarter. If we get that in the process of these two things, the review and the bill, we'd have taken a huge step forward. That's what I'd like to see us doing in the next 12 months.
Okay, excellent. That's a great starter. Thank you very much, Dominic. I totally agree with you on the need to work with this common mission with other representatives of other neurodiverse conditions. I think it's incredibly important. And for me, I talk most about dyslexia because I am dyslexic. But it is actually, we are part of a wider movement, and I think it's very important that we recognise that. Gillian.
Morning, thank you, Matt. Welcome everybody to this morning. Thank you for attending. So I've approached my thoughts on the disparity in dyslexia service provision. I've approached it from my position as CEO of BDA and also as a parent. So I'm a qualified teacher, held the role of SENCO in London schools, but I'm a parent of 2 dyslexic adults, and my son was very recently diagnosed 2 months ago. So I've had that journey and that roadmap through dyslexia as a parent, but also as a professional. So when I was thinking about what are the issues, we're great at identifying the issues, and where do we need to go? How are we going to solve this great conundrum? For me, obviously, a lack of teacher training at that initial time is key. We have to really address that. And we've got our next panel that are going to look at that. But teachers, in my experience, are really keen to know as much as they can about how to support their students. And I do feel we do them a great disservice in not providing them with the correct input that they need to go out into the classroom and offer that support at the time of need for children. Obviously, there's this great big issue around assessments. We know now that, a lot of parents, it comes down to whether you can pay for it or not. We did have a lot of schools that were investing in paying for assessments themselves, but we see the financial crisis hitting hard into our schools, and they're having to make choices between, do we buy exercise books or do we pay for a dyslexia assessment for one child? And what that's done is it's thrown it out to parents who are now also in a financial crisis to have to provide for their children. And I was very lucky that I had connections which enabled me to get tuition for my children, enabled me to access assessments, but not every parent can. And largely it's because it's not a medicalised model, and therefore the emphasis is on education having to provide those assessments within schools. It's not a shared cost across health. But what we can't do is leave families in situations where they're having to pay for it themselves, or if they can't, they're not. The outcome of that is that we have a lot of undiagnosed children within our school system who are rattling around in schools where they haven't had the right input to actually teach them. And so we've got this, as Lord Addington said, groundswell of a problem where children are not getting the support they need at the time they need it. And as we see them move through school, that only gets worse. And we cannot expect our young people to make that transition into employment if we haven't given them what they need within the education system. So for me, the big issue is addressing the assessment issue and ensuring that all children have assessments at the point of need within the setting in which they're educated within. Thank you very much. You're muted, Matt.
I can't believe I made that mistake. Gillian, the BDA has done great work on this over the years, and now really is the moment to be pushing forward. I think you articulate it very well. I'm going to turn to Helen Ross, who's a trustee of the BDA, but also a person in your own right. Helen, what's your?
Hey, so sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
I kind of was scribbling as Dom and Gillian was speaking as well, scribbling by typing. My take is I am dyslexic. I'm also a specialist assessor, but I'm also a PhD, so I've got my doctorate and I do a lot of research into and around dyslexia and lots of shouting and cage rattling around this. And I really wanted to pick up on, I wrote down that Lord Addington said that every teacher is a teacher of SEN, SEND, if we're being, up to date with terminology and legislation with the code of practice. And also with the fact that I do private assessment work as part of my paying the mortgage. And I've said it to people before and I'll say it again, in an ideal world, my private assessment thing wouldn't exist. I'd be like Alison, because I know Alison and Julia, we're both in Wiltshire. I'd work under the banner of a local authority. I don't, because people need people like me, other assessors are available to work with their children because schools don't have capacity. And I think, a couple of years ago, there was an APPG and I came up with a statistic. I can't remember the ins and outs because I'm human, but it was something like 10% of the population is dyslexic. And at the time, and I think I looked at the 2018 January English schools database figures, it was that something like, it worked out that 80% of dyslexics in schools were not identified.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the ins and outs. It's written down, but I'd have to trawl through on my hard drive and it's pain. So what really kind of it is a really very problematic is teacher training at the beginning. I did a systematic review in 2020 as well. And Ofsted itself in 2020, they reviewed their own provision. They said it's inconsistent. And the DFE said, actively, and this was 2019, the resource, I've got my review open in front of me, they don't stipulate the detail as to what's required in SEN teacher training. Well, that's utterly nonsensical. There's a marketisation, the discourse amongst ITT at present is marketisation. I am incredibly cynical that marketisation of teacher training will improve provision for people training initially, when the statutory guidelines as to content, form, delivery, if that's not there, the market doesn't fill that gap, because markets don't work like that. Yeah. So for me, there's a fundamental structural problem in what is expected, what is stipulated as to what training should be for SEN provision, and training for ITT. Fundamental issue around Senko training and access to specialist teachers like me, like Kelly Parkin, like Alison Shaloi, after you've done your initial teacher training, because it costs money. I'm lucky. I have a very kind, gracious, patient husband who helped me, and I was able to earn my way through it. Not everybody has the position of privilege I do, and I realise I'm incredibly fortunate with that. Not everyone had a school that supported me through. I worked at a nice little school in Wiltshire that supported me through. So these structural issues that I, fortunately, as a white British person with a lot of privilege behind me, am able to overcome, not everybody else can. So until we address the fundamental structural problems like money, resources, legislation, statutory guidelines, which is dichotomous and really, frankly, not fit for purpose, there's no point placating, paying lip service to why aren't kids getting identified? Well, they're not getting identified because the structures behind the identification process are not fit for purpose. It's a shambles. You know, local authorities have responsibility but no capacity because multi-academy trusts take all the funding. Local authorities have jurisdiction, but they don't, but they do. The SEND review cannot come soon enough. But like Dominic and Gillian have said previously, it needs to be a unified voice, making sure that policy, practice, guidelines are coherent and supported by fit for purpose, robust, meaty content within teacher training at IT level for those that are going to specialise and be SENCOs or teaching deliverers. And until those things are addressed formally and properly, marketising education, saying, oh, maybe we could screen a few children, until the fundamentals are underpinning that, it just seems not enough for me. Sorry.
Thank you, Helen. I was nodding away, especially the point about having statutory guidance in terms of what goes into teacher training, both initial and CPD. I think is absolutely vital. And you know, my view is that has to be both for all teachers, because of the point of all teachers being teachers of neurodiverse children, and into SENCOs. You know, for me, it's ridiculous that we can say that you can be a SENCO if you're en route to qualification but not qualified. That acknowledges that the qualification is important, but says that you don't actually have to have it yet. So that's one tweak that I'd be looking for, but more broadly, a strategic response. The only bit I didn't quite disagree is two words that you threw in right at the end, which is screening a few children. I think for the purpose of tackling disparities, it's vital. I also know from having been a minister that if you don't, what gets measured gets managed. So it is vital that you do screening to get it on the table. I've been shocked at the lack of data in this area from DFE. The only bit of data I managed to get confirmed was this only 1 in 5 dyslexic kids gets identified at school figure. Because I went to DFE saying, here's an old statistic, about 10 years old, surely you've sorted this. And they came back with the up-to-date data, and it is exactly the same, still 1 in 5, which is appalling. But unless you have the universal aspect of screening, we'll still have huge disparities. So one thing I would add to your analysis is that the likelihood of getting assessed in the private school system, 7% of pupils, is spectacularly higher than in the state system. And the answer to that is a universal approach rather than what is essentially a sort of discretionary hit and miss approach, because that is the only way to try to close those disparities. And I think there's a huge injustice there, that essentially you're much more likely to get the support you need in the private system. And for those who are concerned about over-identification, and I know a thing about false positives myself from another previous role, there is the challenge there is that there may be over-identification in some small parts of the system where a lot of children are pushed through the identification, but it's nothing compared to the massive under-identification across the rest of the system. It's exactly 11 o'clock, so I hope you don't mind that I put my tuppence worth in response to our brilliant panelists on that point. There are several hands that are going up, and a discussion started in the chat. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Gillian Ashley. Apologise that I can't stay for the rest, although my team are on and scribbling notes, and I look forward to hearing the write-up of the rest of the discussion later. But in the meantime, I've got to go and check that Prince Charles does the right thing on having education legislation that, as Dom Addington said, it may not be focused. We're not expecting it to be focused on this area, but potentially amendable in this area, especially in the House of Lords, who take a very liberal approach to what they can amend a bill on. So with that, I will bow out for today. Thank you for your ongoing support, and really urge on you the common mission that we're all working so hard at. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for your time this morning. So we've got some pre-submitted questions, and I know that there's some hands up as well here. I'm in a strange position now where I'm on the panel, but I'm not, because I'm now chairing. So the panel is now Helen and Lord Addington. So one of the questions that we had in from Dominic Watson, who's an EP in Bromley Council, was how can we ensure that dyslexia assessment and identification is not only available to those who can afford to pay for private assessments, and that appropriate interventions are available to all children that need them. And we've covered quite a bit about affording to pay for private assessments, but what about appropriate interventions being available for children that need them? Lord Addington and Helen, what do you think?
I would say it sort of connects to my little rant. I feel so strongly about this because I've worked and I've just had, it was the job I was doing until Easter at school, and I've had to stop for needing to sleep and eat. It's the under-resourcing. When you've got children who really struggle to take on literacy for whatever reason, but particularly when they're dyslexic, if your TA's taken up elsewhere, if there is a TA in the class in the primary school system, then the teacher can't clone themselves. They're one teacher with 30 whatever children with a huge range of needs. So it's resources, it's people, it's physical rooms. Some schools are physically to capacity. They haven't got a little room or a space in a classroom where they can go and have that input. So I think the concept, I tend to agree, actually, as Matt reflected after what I said. I understand why screening is important, because not everyone's got however much money to assess, but a screener at least gives you an indication. So I'll take that bit back and bow to Matt. But I think it's the structures underneath. They're not there because there's no money, buildings, people. For me, that's where it's really lacking, and that's why people have to come to people like me or other tutors outside of school. It's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking.
Lord Addington, have you got a view on assessments and interventions?
Oh, I've got a view on everything. But I would say, carrying on from that, it's the case of, I think Matt is quite right, certainly the political thing about if you don't know it's there, because the greatest way not to have to deal with something is don't identify. That is absolutely a standard way of saying, well, we've got no data on this, you commission no research. So going down there, he is right about that. The problem that we look from the other side is the case of you've identified, but there's nowhere to go, so why have you bothered identifying? So you've actually got to cross that Rubicon and realize the political value and the campaigning value of that. And many of us may be going, well, why are you bothering? But I'm saying, well, probably because I'm afraid it isn't the current generation, it's the next generation we're really fighting for. And that is a very brutal thing to have to say. Unless you invest in at least some awareness of a child of going through, or you think you're going through, at least knowing what you don't do. Don't set them extra work and extra spelling tests, and you work a little smarter, and you tell the teacher it's okay to do that. It's okay. But how can we get to 90% political targets? Well, you have to do something else. And it's that moment of education and awareness, which is probably the first step. And that you probably could do in a couple of years, or a few years anyway, to try and get somebody down there. That is what I would like to see. But if somebody gets identified as being probably dyslexic, and they tell the teacher, well, this is what you don't do with them. And by the way, if they've got to read a book, audio is awfully easy to use now and not that expensive. Indeed, it may be cheaper. And then starting to use things like going into the classroom and building on the back of it and saying, well, you've got to buy one license to use one assistive text system. That is the approach we've got to be taking on board. I don't think you can do it the rest of it. The idea that there is a right form of teaching is the battle. And it's the fact you've got to break through that is what I'd say. And I've probably repeated what I've already said, but that's where I am. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. But we haven't really said anything about assistive technology, but of course we know that that's a major part of supporting our pupils with dyslexia in schools. So thank you, Lord Addington, for raising that. It's really important. So Helen, I think this question is probably for you. How can we make sure that the findings of the vast amount of expensive, robust research into reading and dyslexia get through the classroom door? And Lord Addington, you've already said about signetic phonics not being great at all for our dyslexic pupils. So we know that we've got a problem. Have you got a view, Helen?
Yeah, of course I've got a view. I think for me, it's fundamental initial teacher training, because universities need to be implicated. I understand that school-centered ITT is very important because it is a learning on the job thing. But if you haven't got the input of the people like Judy Hornigold for maths, you know, Angela Fawcett, these people who are like pioneers in research, if you haven't got them putting input into ITT, then well, what's the point of the research? The whole point, the reason I'm not a university-based academic is because I want to use the research I do. You know, I talk to schools, I work in Wiltshire, I share my findings and I talk to teachers. And that's ongoing CPD, which is underpinned by these brilliant, amazing, pioneering academics who, when I grow up, want to be like them, who really do understand the mechanics of what dyslexia means for learning, who can then disseminate what to do about it because they know, because they research it, you know, and the different types of research. So the quantitative stuff gives you the kind of, this intervention does this much progress. The qualitative research, which gives you the understanding of how children feel, how teachers are able to engage with research. It's the research that informs teacher training, that then teachers share, and then independent little rogue academics like me go and do our own thing and share that nationally. We share it, you know, I do a lot of work nationally and across lots of different areas. A CPD, because we talk to people, we share it, because there's no point leaving things in a textbook at the back of a university room. It's a chocolate fireguard.
Helen, I think we need lots of you. We need to clone you, because you are that bridge between research and practice that we need and are desperate for.
Be careful what you wish for.
Lord Addington, have you got a view on?
Just really to come back through this, saying you can get this vast amounts of research, etc., but applying a little bit of common sense. When I actually said before about, you know, books are now available in audio form, that's not assistive tech. That's a new leisure experience for literature. You know, I mean, it's not, I mean, it's something that's there. The fact that the assistive tech is available on Windows systems. True, half the people who install it couldn't find it if you paid them to without giving them a half hour's warning. But the fact is, it's there. And the fact that one of the things we're not taking across here, and we should actually be trying to get across, is most of this stuff is actually available easily now. Now, everybody's about 10 years behind. The current Minister for Education in the Lords, Baroness Bauer, is the first minister I haven't had to show assistive tech books. There are people down there who are starting to learn to use it. So I just think that if we have got to remember that, A, it's standard practice. I mean, I haven't sent a text without talking to my phone for years. I mean, funny looks on trains, but that's about it. You know, you've got to try and say it is very easily available. And the change to this attitude of a classroom, I think, is what I would like to see. The fact that, you know, you've got a microphone on and you might be talking quietly, you have to sit at the back. The back of the room isn't just for the bad boys anymore, it's for the people who don't need sound on their microphones. You know, that is the sort of change I'd like to see going through. But most of this stuff is actually very, very, it doesn't take much. It just says, this is why you do it. Okay, fine. Can they hand in a bit of written work now? Yes, great, let's go do. And I'm just saying, we're not alone in this as well. You know, the same tech used slightly differently helps dozens of different groups. But there endeth the lesson.
Thank you, Lord Addington. You've actually answered our next question, which was from Teresa Levy, Executive Director of Children's Services in Dorset. And she was asking, how do you see the role of assistive tech being helpful in this area, and how quickly can a 21st century offer be rolled out to all schools? I mean, it's frustrating. This is my view. I'll put my frustration out there that in COVID, we were all very, very acutely aware of technology poverty. And so the government invested in laptops for all children. Where are those laptops now? Why are they being used within our classroom setting? Are children accessing all those free accessibility tools within Microsoft and other programs, you know, all of these things that we know work, what's happening out there. I do want to also say, Helen, before I bring you in, that Janet Goring has made a really good point in the chat to, you know, highlight all of the good practice that's going on in schools. And Janet is based in Westminster and runs an excellent inclusive service. So, you know, perhaps we can hear from Janet as well. Helen, assistive tech.
Okay. I use assistive tech. Like the read aloud function on Windows, it just saves my life. And it costs nothing. It's not rocket science. It's really not. I've done rocket science. I did engineering. That is not it. But when it's a school administered system, and I've had it in schools I've worked, you go and you talk to the person that's in charge of it, and they don't know it's there, or they don't know how to switch whatever bit of the database needs it. It's infuriating. It costs nothing. It's built into Office 365. You've literally paid for it in schools. I'm not an Apple person. We are very much a Windows-based house, but I understand that within Macs and, you know, iPhones and stuff, there's all that you talk at it and it writes down what you want. Google has the same. It's built in. It's not rocket science. You know, we've got Julia, there's scanning pens, there's Orcams, there's, I don't know, Clouter. There's so many different flavors of tech that exist. It costs nothing per se if you've got Windows. But when it comes to the more high-end tech, it costs. But I come back, little country called Uruguay, I've been there before. Some of you may have heard me say, every child, I think it's as of 2009, I think, El Plan Cival, every child in a state school gets a laptop. It's not your Waitrose posh one, other shops are available. It's a basic one, but it's equipped, which means kids have Wi-Fi, kids can use assistive tech, because I think they're Windows based. I need to double check with the organization because I'm in contact with them. It's things like this. If Uruguay, a little dinky country relative to the economy size of the UK, can manage that, and we managed to get laptops for people during COVID, what are we doing? Just what are we doing? Clearly not enough. Sorry, makes me angry.
No, absolutely. It is frustrating. We know that because there's a clear route there into the use of assistive tech in schools. And, you know, it's frustrating to think that we're not actually utilising the tools that we know are out and available. I don't know if I have got Janet on. Janet, are you with us? Is there anything you'd like to say? No. Okay, so I'll move on to our next question, or our last question that was pre-submitted for this panel. And this is from Craig Collinson, Researcher Development Fellow at Edgehill University. Are arguments over defining dyslexia and thus problems with EP reports a distraction from dealing with the barriers experienced by dyslexics? Lord Addington, would you like to have a say on defining dyslexia?
Well, as not an academic and somebody who is dyslexic himself, I know that dyslexics are like me. Then I discovered they weren't. Then I discovered it was a very complicated field. And then it was thumped into me over many years that it's a spectrum. No two of us are alike. The same is true of all the other spectrum conditions we've been talking about today, or I've been talking about today. So I think you have to get somebody together who's going to say, these are the generally accepted parameters. Any academic who says this is a definitive answer should be killed and left in a large pile. I'll bury them for you. And going down, so you've got something functional to work from. But that is really where you've got to go. Now, the same that every other one of the other fields, whenever I've spoken to them, has very similar limitations. There was also, you know, the person who's very mildly, are they still dyslexic? Well, do you bother including them at certain levels? You come back in, you do something else. You've got all these, but you actually have got to take something in the middle of the ground and go on with that. Because if you don't, all the research, all the teaching, I mean, is shot to pieces. And there have been examples where they said, oh no, it's just reading. I mean, you can remember the thing about Warwick, etc. Went down about this. You've got to, and when it was challenged, the government decided to back, you know, the fact there was a condition. If you're going to do this, you've got to get a consensus position and limit what goes on outside. But if you start saying there are little specialist groups, you are in real trouble. We can't work like that. Matt, me, any other politician who's interested in this cannot do anything in those circumstances. Also, you could stick in there by saying, you know, is it a disability? Under law, you don't get help unless it's a disability or disabling condition. So be very careful about your language here. So please please get a degree of consensus, because I can't do anything with a dozen different definitions and people going off and saying, but these are general consensuses. Otherwise, I can't help you.
Thank you, Lord Addington. And Helen, have you got some views on?
Yes, I think it's quite interesting because whenever we went to London the other week, didn't we, Gillian? We had quite a long discussion. There's a SASC consultation that finished Friday gone, and it was talking about the definitions of dyslexia and all the rest of it. And for me, it kind of seemed a bit superficial. It was a bit daft, because there is a working definition. There's ISS. There's a definition I can assess to. It's phonological awareness, verbal memory, and verbal processing. I have tests that work to this. If somebody's wobbly in those areas, I say child A has a weakness in this, as demonstrated in this test result. It's like appeal. It's a point, evidence, explain, and link that you teach children in year 7. I write my reports like that so that it's very clear that my diagnosis maps directly onto the 3 mainly identified areas within the BDA definition. And I think it's 2019 it was written initially. I need to double check the date. So there is a working definition. I don't really understand why people say there's not an operationalized definition, because there is, and it's there, and it's written in a lot of places on the internet. It takes Jim Rose's elements from the 2009 report of Jim Rose as well. So I think, yes, it is a distraction, and local authorities want to distract because they don't want to spend the money. I'm from Warwickshire. Makes me really angry. My brother went through at school because he's dyslexic and has autism. Very fortunate we could pay, but there is an operationalized definition. It seems to me to be hot air about something, nothing, and I don't get it. I don't understand why, apart from money and resources. That's my thoughts. A bit cynical, but
thank you. I'm conscious that we have actually got Dr. Craig Collinson with us in the room. And I just wondered if you might have a view yourself, because you've asked the question.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Over to you.
I'll put my cards on the table. I'm dyslexic myself, as well as being an academic. I don't really write on dyslexia per se. I write on lexism. And lexism is the normative practices and assumptions of literacy. So they are a lot of what Lord Addington was referring to, and how those other and discriminate dyslexics. So it's really, I don't really use, the concept of dyslexia doesn't really help me much in that. My concern is looking at it in terms of something closer to racism and sexism. And a lot of the things that Matt Hancock and Lord Addington were saying about norms of literacy and educational norms of literacy being problematic, well, that's my concern. And my concern is that a lot of the obsession, the likes of Julian Elliott and things like that, there's a sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah, okay, there are lots of problems with lots of different definitions of dyslexia, mainly because we have problems with defining literacy and we have problems with defining intelligence. So if you've got problems with that, you're not going to get anywhere with much traction in defining dyslexia. And there's a tendency to think of it in essentialist terms. So there's an essence which we're looking for. Whereas in fact, what we're dealing with is a lot of social attitudes towards literacy and the belief that you should be. I mean, that doesn't detract from the fact if a child's got a problem, they've got a problem, they've got issues, they've got challenges. But if you try and encapsulate that and say it's a thing, then that's more problematic. Whereas if you look at norms of literacy and you look at the problems that norms of literacy cause, then you're trying to open it out and see it in a different way. Otherwise, we're going to get stuck, because the BDA may have its definition, but that doesn't really count for a lot amongst academia, because in academia it's a much wider body of evidence. And what Lord Addington is saying about we need a concrete definition. Well, look at the norms of literacy, which various governments have created and enforced, and then look at the fact that not everybody can meet them. That's the problem. You've created a system where there's a bottleneck. Educational psychologist reports are there to stop people getting assessed, not stop getting people getting assistance, not enable them to get assistance. So a wide screening program, I think, would be great. Whether it will work.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. That was really valuable inputs. And just to say, we've had a lot of activity in the chat, and we will be using what you've put. So any solutions that you've got, do pop them in the chat. So I'm going to close that first panel with a huge thank you to Dr. Helen Ross and Lord Dominic Addington. As always, your views are, really on point and exactly what we need. So do stay on for the next panel. Lord Addington, if you've got to rush off, we appreciate your time this morning. So moving on to the next panel, it's teacher training and culture. And on the panel, we've got Julia Clouter, Head of Education at Scanning Pens, Kelly Parkin, Specialist Teacher within Rotherham Council, Tricia Sterling, Executive Dean, Faculty of Education, Newman University, and Alison Saloy, Specialist Advisory Teacher, Wiltshire County Council. So I'm going to hand straight over to Julia to give her views on teacher training and culture.
Lovely, thank you. Yes, so I'm Julia. I'm Head of Education at Scanning Pens. This is actually the second part of my career, which is within the education technology industry and supporting teachers to use and understand the ways that assistive technology can create equity for reading for all learners. That's my passion, it really is. But before becoming Head of Education at Scanning Pens, my role was as a trainer, teacher, within local authorities, as an advisor and an SPLD specialist. I was actually really lucky. I was one of the teachers who benefited from the Rose Review back in 2019, I think, and was one of the cohort of teachers who undertook the ATS AMDA Specialist Dyslexia Training Programme. And for that, I am very grateful, because it's underpinned my professional work ever since. So I took my specialist skills to PRUs and special schools, both in primary and secondary schools, and spent a huge amount of time with young people who'd been excluded. And the majority of the exclusions were for behaviours, complex conduct disorders, and often resulting from ACE, adverse childhood experiences. But something that many of these young people had in common was undiagnosed dyslexia and other neurodiverse difficulties, and also reading difficulties. So my lens was very, very focused on individual support, writing learning passports, managing transitions for young people between schools, perhaps with some assistive technology advice, but providing support to teachers to give them the tools that they could help with inclusive learning opportunities for children who were struggling. I experienced a lot of bottlenecks, which has just been mentioned, and I thought that was really interesting. Bottlenecks around not being able to get the right information, and then bottlenecks around not getting the right support, and then bottlenecks around not being able to get the right provision at the other end after you'd done a piece of work with a child in a special school, that they would fall into or go back into a mainstream provision and not have their needs met, which would then cause further failure. So I've seen a huge cycle of what happens when the support is not in place, when early intervention is not in place, when diagnostic work does not take place, and the human impact of that. So that was the first part of my career. And I joined Scanning Pens as Head of Education because I realised I'd be able to have an impact on the reading progress of more children, and work with teachers, not just in schools and in the workplace, but in the prison services as well, and supporting the implementation of assistive technology like our reader pens, providing training and support for schools, so who might be, for example, using reader pens to help children to learn as part of a toolbox, or using the exam readers to help those young people to be able to achieve in exams because they know how to answer the exam, they just can't read the question. So this is now my work that I do with scanning pens. And I know it's enabling many young people to show what they know rather than showing that they've got a problem with reading. I'm also an ambassador for the charity Succeed with Dyslexia, and in that role I'm able to share information about SEN, hidden learning needs, dyslexia, and get wonderful professionals like Helen to come and talk and be part of learning festivals that we can share with teachers and professionals. So I'm in a great position because I can help to cascade the information out to teaching professionals and bring in some really great speakers along the way. I recently wrote a blog for Chambers, and it's called Dyslexic Readers Would Rather Eat Green Eggs and Ham, and why we need a toolbox approach to reading on World Book Day. But that's because it was World Book Day. And what I've really been thinking about is how we change the landscape for learners with literacy difficulties, including for those learners who are undiagnosed dyslexics, to help them. And for those children who just struggle with the mechanics of reading, which are many, and how on earth do we tackle this in the classroom? And is it at the earliest phase? It really needs to be. And I think there are some simple solutions, like providing a toolbox of supports for teachers that could be in every classroom, and some information to those teachers on how to use those supports. It's got to come with that implementation advice. And some of those supports are low tech, easy things. I'm talking about a toolbox in a classroom full of stuff that children can self-select and go and pick and take and use in a class, and that teachers can encourage those young people to use those tools. And the reason we need to start early is because stigma starts early. And so if we have got a really great approach where we say, hey, everybody can use anything in this toolbox, any tool that you like. It might be a coloured overlay that you just go and choose and you explore and you play with. It might be a reader pen, fantastic if you need that bit of reading support to help you to be able to decode words very fast because you can't navigate around a dictionary. That's something a reader pen will do really well. Or it might be, as Lord Addington mentioned, it might be audiobooks that the children are listening to at the class at the time. It might be high-low readers. There are so many things that could go into a really simple assistive technology toolbox. Some of them don't cost any money at all. Part of the toolbox is about ensuring that teachers have knowledge of these platforms and what tools are embedded in the platforms so that children, when they are using their IT in class, can go and do that. But big tech is not the answer to everything for our learners. Sometimes the supports can just be in your hand, a reading ruler. And if as part of teacher training, we had a toolbox approach where teachers had some implementation understanding, if it's a mid-tech piece of technology that's going to support, then you are going to need a bit of implementation understanding of how best to deliver that tool and talking about that tool in a classroom. So I would be advocating for the use of assistive technology as a normal way of teaching, rather than us talking about tools as let's make this your normal way of working. Let's embed perhaps the teacher modelling the use of a reader pen as a normal way of teaching. That way we break down the stigma and children will start picking up and using the tools. There are brilliant apps that are available on mobile phones that everyone will be using outside of school that they could have been using perhaps in the classroom because they're going to do a brilliant job of helping them in the classroom, and yet no, that doesn't happen. So there are some sort of fundamental questions that we could be asking about the text that people use, the assistive technology supports that are fantastic, that are available. If we've got problems with Wi-Fi at home and connectivity, again, there are tools that can be used at home to support young people to read if they aren't advantaged enough to be able to have connectivity at home. So the reader pen can be used with no connectivity. I think there are problems and I think there are supports for those problems, but we've got to be proactive in bringing this toolbox of assistive text to every classroom. Start as we can.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's
Sorry,
so
I've got very
interesting.
enthusiastic there. I should stop.
But really practical. And actually, that's what this session is all about. We know what the issues are. We want to know how can we solve those issues. And I think a toolbox approach is really beneficial. I'm going to move on to Kelly Parkin, specialist teacher within Rotherham.
Hello, thank you. Good morning. So yes, my name's Kelly and I'm a specialist teacher that works for Rotherham Local Authority, our specialist inclusion team. And I've been a specialist advisory teacher for 10 years now. And my mum was dyslexic and had a terrible experience of education at that time. And out of my 3 children, my 2 boys, they find education very easy, luckily. But my youngest, Penny, absolutely hates it. She's very dyslexic, and you can already see that hatred for literacy, and I'm determined that she will not experience the same education path that my mum did. As part of my role within the service, obviously we do a lot of training within school. I know a lot of people have talked about, the costs behind things, and obviously as a local authority, there are academy chains now in schools, and everything has been impacted on how much we can support in schools, which is tragic because it's gradually over the years changed from being a service that was only kind of 50% traded, where schools had to pay for, but the rest was government paid for, so you could go in and support those children that needed the highest level of support. So over the years, things have changed, but fortunately, the majority of schools, there's 85 schools in the Rotherham Borough that still use our service to support those students. And it's not just the dyslexic. I know we're talking about dyslexic students today, but I think I manage an outreach provision, which we have done for the last 8 years, and it's a termly support where we go in and work directly with the dyslexic students for 2 hours a week. They need to be in the classroom, they need to be accessing the rest of the curriculum. That's very, very important. But from an early point of view of building those skills and helping them before they get to the point where that self-esteem is rock bottom and they don't want to learn anymore, that's where we come in. And it's been trying to bring some of the positive experiences that are going on in schools for our dyslexic learners. It's been a really, really magnificent impact on some of the learners. And I think feeding from that, it's more importantly, we've worked with the teachers of those students and the TAs of those students, so that it's not just something that's done in a classroom outside of the main classroom, but that practice is then being brought into the classroom, and it's giving that teacher the confidence to say, right, actually, this is how they learn best. We've spent time with them personally, and we know their learning strategies. This is how you can support them in the classroom. It doesn't matter if they're not going to write the same as the person next to them. It doesn't matter if they don't read that text the same as everybody else. This is what that student needs. So it's a very personal approach to learning, but on a short-term basis to give a boost, but then have a long-term effect to support in the school. From a teacher training point of view, I absolutely agree with everybody that said that it has to be statutory, it has to be a mandatory thing, that everybody before they set foot in a classroom has training on all of the neurodiversity areas, not just dyslexia, but actually just, I think someone put in the chat about having a half-day training on the whole of SEN. It's impossible. We've been lucky to work with Helen University with their BA Honours primary teachers, and we've done it as a drip feed. So we did a full day session in their first year, just doing the basics of dyslexia. And then in the second year, we did another session with them, having had some time to put some of these things into practice, and very much on a workshop basis. We've said dyslexia is a spectrum, and even though they might teach a handful of dyslexic students in 1 year, the second year, they could have completely different needs. And out of the 200 students we've supported through READ, our Rotherham Enhanced Action for Dyslexia, I don't think I've ever met one student who's the same. And, when we do work in the alternative provisions, we do work in the COMPs where these children are at risk of permanently exclusion. So it's what do they need right now so that they can access their learning. And I think for teachers to feel confident enough to be able to kind of challenge and say, no, this isn't appropriate for this student, they need to be doing something else. They can kind of only do that if they've got the knowledge and the understanding to say why that is important, that they have alternative provision to other people in the classroom. So I do think I'm a big advocate for training for staff and empowering them to be able to give the students the best education that they can, and also getting in early before that self-esteem impacts on their access to their education.
Thank you, Kelly. And I think there's a common thing there that both yourself and Julia are highlighting. So, you know, having the right training, getting it in early, and, you know, not making sure that self-esteem is not impacted on. So I'm handing over now to Tricia Sterling, Executive Dean, Faculty of Education, Newman University.
Thank you, Gillian. It's been really interesting listening to you all, and from a perspective from a Faculty of Education and a teacher training provider, I couldn't agree with you more in what you're trying to say in terms of the foundations of our teachers and understanding neurodivergence should start with us, absolutely, particularly. And this really struck me last week when I met with a friend who had twin daughters who were 24, one of whom about 3 weeks ago was identified by her employer as an accountant. She was doing her accountancy exams and was really struggling to catch up with other people in the room when she was doing her exam because she couldn't read through her questions quick enough. And it turned out he actually put her through a screening and found out that she was dyslexic. Her twin sister then went to her employer and said that the employer put her through screening and found the same thing. They were both identified by the employer as really struggling in terms of communication, not just their exams, which was detrimental to their progress, but some of the key things in terms of employability that they'd identified were of a concern to them. So I reflected on this, and Mum was a very keen reader from a very early age with them. And they both came through primary school, secondary school, further education and university, all through an education system without being identified at any point in time, probably because they were quite bright and actually managed to have coping mechanisms to get themselves through. It was very poignant for me as that they'd actually got through the whole system, and it was actually impacting them later on when they were going to employment. To put this in context, some of you talk about teacher training, what you're saying there, Kelly, yes, in terms of an undergraduate program for 3 years where you can train to be a teacher, there is room and space to put that information in, to do more deeper learning, reflection, more practice. But a majority of our teachers come into practice and to the profession now through postgraduate courses. And postgraduate courses are 9 months long. Often, particularly secondary, a majority of secondary teachers come through postgraduate courses. And within those 9 months that they're training to be a teacher, with a background of a relevant subject area in an undergraduate degree, but very little understanding and knowledge about how children learn, particularly about neurodivergence, particularly about different needs and all sorts of aspects of children. They don't come with that knowledge. So to actually get them to understand how the brain works and being and understanding different types of children, we just talked about the range of diversity in 9 months, they come into a program really mainly concerned about can they control a classroom in the first instance. And then we have the boundaries and the parameters by which we're restricted to in terms of regulation by the DfE in terms of the ITT criteria and the core content framework, one of which is originally in the market review. We have to have the core content framework in our training within this 9 months for most postgraduates, and one of them is SSP. We have to be training in SSP. And also that's an Ofsted requirement as well that we're regulated. But one of the particular regulations around this 9 months is that they have to spend 120 days in school. So that's 2/3 of their practices in school. And in terms of the way that government is moving, that they're really trying to centralise training in schools, the pressure being on mentors and teachers in schools to train our teachers. And we've just already talked about the pressures they already have and some of the needs they need in terms of their own training around particularly dyslexia and special educational needs. So they're being expected to train our teachers for us. So in a third of that time, the time that we have with them, which is very little, at best we have the space to give awareness of special needs. And we talked about that half-day workshop. What we try to do very hard is to train our tutors and our mentors at university-based training around special needs, about understanding neurodivergence and about highlighting that and bringing that forward in terms of pedagogies and how that would be around subject, around that be teacher and learning and assessment, and managing behaviour. So it is all around, we try to embed that where best we can. But really we do depend upon schools then when they go into schools to actually enhance and develop that in a practical sense and to recognise that. We've just already identified that over 80% of children are not identified in schools. So it's a real tension there about the pressure to centralise teacher training in schools, and there's a pressure around the market review to push more training of teachers into school-centred initial teacher training and to move it out of universities, and also around this whole cycle of a PGC in 9 months. But we know it's almost a false economy and almost really struggling with the expertise, because we know that within 5 years, a trainee teacher moving into a newly qualified teacher, over 50% of them shows that they will leave the profession. So we're putting in a lot of time, resource and effort to train teachers, and that half of them are leaving the profession early on. And so then it's just this ongoing chain of trying to bring and educate people through in teachers. And whether or not this is really a false economy of what we're doing in terms of we have to meet the supply chain for teachers, but it really whether or not we're doing. So therefore, we're dependent upon the early career. Someone talked about the early career framework earlier in one of the messages about what we do in the 2 years. And the early career training is very much dependent on a mentor in school that's going to give 30 hours to that training. So it's about, as a university, what we're trying to do is think of ways that we can actually support, but it's very much outsourced to different companies. There's 8 different providers of early career training, which are not linked to universities. And that goes through, in terms of the mentors in the schools going through that training. But it's only 30 hours that they have to do that, in terms of not just in special educational needs, but across the board. In terms of when we look at the new papers that are coming out in terms of Senko's, Senko really does support trainees and teachers in schools. And what support do they have in terms of their training, and the resource and finance to do that as well is a particular idea. So we're doing all we can in terms of what we've started to do, particularly at Newman, is think about the pre-course training, is actually putting modules in place pre-course to get our trainees to understand children, about neurodivergence, about children's learning, before they even started thinking about training to teach, and understanding the little people and well, young people, adults that they will work with in FE colleges. And that's really quite key. And so really, for me, it is a tension. I don't disagree with what you're saying, but we're working within the time and the parameters and the regulation that we have to try and do and achieve what we want to do for the best of our young people.
Tricia, thank you. I think you've brought to the panel, a real understanding of the limitations that universities have actually got. We're all very quick to say, we need to train our teachers better, but what you've done is highlighted that it's not as easy as that you're working within a limited framework yourselves, and as much as you'd like to do more, there's a limitation. Before I hand over to Alison, I've just seen Lord Addington wave, so I think he might want to say something, or he might have been saying goodbye. I'm not sure. I think he's dropped out. So yeah, thank you, Tricia. I think that is really, really valuable. Thank you very much. So I'm going to hand over to our last panellist, who's Alison Saloy, Specialist Advisory Teacher, Wiltshire County Council.
Thank you. Yes, and I've been reflecting on what everyone's been saying this morning, and I'm thinking particularly about issues regarding training, particularly I think within in-service training, so for teachers within schools, and also more generally on some of the issues surrounding dyslexia. I'm an advisory teacher, as Gillian introduced me, with Wiltshire Council Specialist SEN Service. And we're a service part of Wiltshire Council, which is available to all maintained schools and academies, and we're not a traded service. So perhaps these days, rather unusually, we're not a traded service. I've been a specialist teacher since 2004, and I've worked in advisory capacities within a number of local authorities and also within the independent sector. And as well, I've been a lecturer at Bath Spa University and a tutor on the dyslexia courses, various undergraduate and postgraduate courses. Within this time, if I reflect back since 2004 and the time that I've been particularly focusing on dyslexia within my career, I've seen an increasing focus on assessment and screening. So it's great to be hearing everything that we're hearing today. And whilst I absolutely agree that there is a place for this, I'm really aware that assessment isn't the end in itself. And I'm in many ways more concerned about what is it that we do for pupils with literacy difficulties and dyslexia. whether or not the pupil has a label of dyslexia. It's really what we do that makes the difference to affecting positive outcomes for children and young people. And that's what I'm really focusing on and most concerned about, really. I fully believe that dyslexia-friendly schools, whether it's formally through the British Dyslexia Association quality mark or through other routes, is the way forward. And I'm also recognising that there's some really good dyslexia-friendly practice in schools who don't have a quality mark, or who perhaps haven't gone down that route. But nevertheless, there is some really great practice out there as well. And I think that's important to look at, and to look at how schools, where there is good practice, can be supporting other schools, because that's a really powerful tool and mechanism. I do believe that dyslexia-friendly schools is the way forward, because it focuses on helping pupils access learning across the curriculum more effectively. It focuses on implementing effective intervention, and it involves working with parents and carers, helping parents and carers better understand perhaps how they can support their own children as well. And crucially, it focuses on helping pupils have a better understanding of their own learning and how they can help themselves, and helping them view their learning more positively. So I think all of those things are really crucial and need to be happening to be affecting those positive outcomes. As I said, whether the pupil has a label of dyslexia or not, we recognise, we identify the difficulties, and then we're doing something about it. And to me, that's what makes the biggest difference. I'm currently involved in delivering involved in supporting a dyslexia project in Wiltshire, in which Wiltshire Council is supporting 18 maintained schools, primary and secondary schools across the county, to achieve the British Dyslexia Association quality mark. And the project aims to improve schools' understanding of dyslexia, and also to help schools develop strategies that support the achievement and engagement of dyslexic learners. It requires commitment from everybody in school and a review of approaches to monitoring and assessment. So it is about identifying areas of need, identifying strengths, and monitoring ongoing process. So that wider concept of assessment and identification. It's focusing on teaching and learning and differentiation, and helping pupils access learning more effectively, and also a commitment to high quality, inclusive practice across the range of ability and need. So far, we've delivered a full programme of training, which we put in place in 2020, so right in the midst of the pandemic. We've had to think very quickly and act in different ways. And thinking about assistive technology, we've had to learn really quickly how to do things differently. So a very full programme of training that we've been able to put in place, and ongoing we're providing support for our schools who are taking part in the Dyslexia Friendly project. And I should say that's alongside our usual day-to-day work that we do within the specialist SEN service, in terms of helping schools identify needs and support pupils with a wide range of needs across schools in Wiltshire. So as I said, that's open to all schools within the county, all maintained schools. So we're currently in the second year of the project. We launched in 2020, and we're working really hard to be moving our schools forward to hopefully be achieving that dyslexia friendly schools quality mark, with the first of our schools, fingers crossed, aiming to achieve dyslexia friendly status later this term. And we're really looking forward to seeing the impact on pupil outcomes, and that's something that we're going to be evaluating independently, with some support from Dr. Helen Ross, who spoke earlier. So I think, in summary, summing up my thoughts and everything that I've been saying, I think that developing and implementing the principles of dyslexia-friendly schools. So yes, I think aiming for those quality marks is absolutely, that to me, that's the gold standard. But I think it's we know that not all schools are going to work towards or necessarily become dyslexia-friendly schools, aiming towards that quality mark formally. But nevertheless, it's taking those underlying principles that underpin dyslexia-friendly schools, essentially effective good practice, that I do believe needs to be the way forward. So, thank you.
Alison, thank you very much. Panellists, we've got 4 questions that have been pre-submitted. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to all answer all 4, so I'll start, and if somebody's waving at me, I'll move to you to give an answer. So the first one is, how will teacher training incorporate the understanding about dyslexia and help support newly qualified teachers recognise why and how a child in their class is struggling? And that was submitted from Amy Appleton, specialist dyslexia teacher and assessor, Dyslexia Sparks. Anyone on the panel want to start? How will teaching training incorporate the understanding about dyslexia? Anybody got a view?
I think it's probably, is it up to each individual university really of their teacher training package, what they offer, because they can choose, like I know you talked about the PGCE students, which again is something we do. So it has to be embedded in something in their initial practice before they go out. But like Tricia said, it's got to be something that the mentors and the other people that are seeing them all the time, or people in the school that they're working with, can support on an ongoing process. Because you know yourself, we can attend a training session, but then 2 years later, you're not going to necessarily remember all the nitty-gritty bits of that training session. It's got to be embedded throughout everything that you do. But I do think there has to be some sort of initial level of understanding and sharing of good practice before the everyday stuff can support that further.
I agree, Kelly. I mean, in terms of, research shows that CPD, a few hours of CPD is very superficial and doesn't sit and doesn't land in terms of embedding practice particularly well at all. And so you're right, it is down to the foundations. And I think, working with the BDA, I think universities could come up with a better or a more common practice, which would be consistent across the board. And if there's that consistent practice and package that went to schools as well to support the mentors and all stakeholders in the training of our teachers, then we can all talk from a common framework, of which then could be supported to be ongoing for longevity and have impact on our young people. So I agree. I think it's something we should work with together. And like you say, it is about that choice, and perhaps you should have that sort of choice and flexibility around what you deliver, but there's a common framework. I think universities and teacher training providers particularly would really value that. And if you talk to the trainees, all they want, they ask you all the time about resource, give me, and they're wanting that information and resource. And if we had something we could give them as part of their training package, that would be just fantastic.
Julia.
We have teacher training standards, don't we? And there is an opportunity to insert into this document some really significant statements around what we want people to be achieving in terms of their knowledge of SEND at particular milestones. So that's one way that we could go about addressing this challenge, that we can't fit everything into the teacher training experience at the moment. So that's one way. But the other thing I'm thinking is, actually there is a world of fabulous CPD available out there, available from assistive tech companies, available from people like the BDA and from Succeed with Dyslexia. And there is such high quality information out there. I know, because I helped put it out there, and I would love for more teachers to recognise that this is an available resource and perhaps connect with more universities and teacher training providers, so that they would know, oh, Scanning Pens provides a mini demo school program for embedding the use of reader pens. Great, I can really help my particular teachers who are interested in this along that pathway. And I think this is the same for other tech companies too. There is a world of resource out there. It is just a question of, can we join the dots? Can we bring this together? And then can we make sure that there is an overarching accreditation that will take into account these little independent bits of CPD that can be achieved?
Tricia, could I ask you a question? How much do the universities talk to each other about the design of their teacher training offer? Is it something that is done independently, where you work on your own, or do you actually have that communal voice?
We do very much recently. All institutions have had to go through accreditation process again. The government has asked us, every single institution, to submit an application for accreditation in February this year. So we were working together more more collaboratively just recently around some of those. But particularly there's a core content framework that's been provided by the government of the things that our trainees are entitled to or should be training within as a minimum expectation within that. And if you have a look at it, does talk about special needs, but it isn't specific around certain aspects of that, or particularly where the resources where you go to. So again, we do work together, but very much we have very different needs in different areas as well, as you know. So while we might have common things, we talked about all children, particularly in Birmingham here, we have very different, diverse to, for example, Chester, where I used to work, which is a very different demographic. So you have to really meet the needs of your community and the teachers that you train within your community and service. So, I mean, we do talk around that, but I think there could be more collaborative work. And through USEP, we provided that opportunity to collaborate, but particularly around these areas, it would be more useful if there was some forum or network that we could have, which would allow us to inform our training, that way.
And then James Green, who's joined us this morning, has asked, what role do Ofsted play in all of this? And I know for a long time the BDA have advocated for Ofsted to track a dyslexic child on an Ofsted inspection in schools, so that we could have that real understanding of what's going on in a school for a dyslexic pupil. But what role does Ofsted play at university level? Do they at all?
In terms of they do come and look at us about what we're doing in terms of special needs and the delivery of particularly how we train our teachers effectively, and that is a particular focus for them. There's also particularly there can be focused inspections around those areas, particular institutions. It's quite a rigorous inspection at the moment, given that they are kind of hiring the expectations around this particular area. So if anyone's read some of the Ofsted inspections around that, the universities and providers are not particularly coming out as strongly as they would have done in the back, but the expectations around how we actually train our teachers is increasing, and with minimum amount of time, but with increased expectations of what we have to include in our programme.
Thank you. So Kate Ross has submitted a question. She's a class teacher at Church Green Primary School. How can teachers be better prepared to deliver the national curriculum in a meaningful way that ensures that dyslexic children can reach the same age-related expectations as their peers? And what financial commitment, and she's put in brackets, from the government, is needed to allow this revolution in educational practice to happen? So panellists, what do you make of that question?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about this, and certainly the first part of it, Gillian, if that's helpful. Yes, I do think that teachers can be better prepared to deliver the national curriculum, but I think that's only part of it. I think there's two parts, well, maybe three parts to this question in many ways, but certainly in a meaningful way through training and awareness raising. So, for example, some of the training, that in-service training that I mentioned earlier today. And I think there's really 5 key areas that we need to focus on in doing this. So I think it's, first of all, raising awareness of the importance, the absolute vital that we know our pupils. So we know, as teachers, we know their strengths, their interests, and yes, their specific difficulties, the difficulties the pupils may have, and the things that are important to them. So perhaps the things the pupils want to get better on about. So I think that is one of the things we need to do to be helping enable pupils to make progress, that accelerated progress. Differentiated learning needs to happen. We know that's absolutely crucial. That's Teachers Standard 5. So it's inherent to good practice, it's inherent to teaching. And that teaching needs to be relevant and at appropriate level to the individual, but at the same time challenging the pupil too. So it's that careful balance. The third point is we need to be thinking about minimising barriers to help pupils access the curriculum with increasing independence. So that fits in with differentiation as well. So thinking about, for example, the use of technology that we've reflected upon already this morning. And I think one of the things that's really important, recognised by documents such as the Greg Brooks documents, Education Endowment Foundation documents, that there is an absolute place for additional targeted intervention to help pupils' accelerated learning. Reflecting on some of the comments that people have put in the chat box earlier today, is it about supporting or is it about helping pupils make progress? Well, actually, I think it's about both. Yes, it is about helping pupils find ways around things, but at the end of the day, if we want to help a pupil accelerate progress, for example, with reading, oftentimes we need some intervention, some really good individualized, research-based, evidence-based intervention to help accelerate that progress. And this is, of course, all covered within, for example, the Dyslexia Friendly Schools process. But I think there is more to it than this as well. I think, yes, we're looking about how we can help pupils make accelerated progress and better access the curriculum. But I think it's also really important that we're thinking about the way that we assess and perhaps measure what do we mean by age-related expectations, and is that the be all and end all? Because of course, no, it isn't the be all and end all in any way. So I think it's also a case of looking at the assessments that we use. We know that many of the assessments that are used in schools, that schools have to use, the Year 1 phonic check, the focus on SPAG, the multiplication check, SATs, very current at the moment, and also the sorts of ways we assess pupils in secondary schools, in GCSE, often draw on many of the things pupils with dyslexia are likely to find difficult. So we need to be really careful that we try to help pupils access assessments, but also that we don't disadvantage them by the type of assessments that we use. And we need to look at the way we're using the information from assessments, something I feel really strongly about. A lot of pupils I work with find the phonic check really difficult. And they're considered to have failed. They failed at Year 1. I mean, what does that mean? Let's try to reframe it. Let's try to use the phonic check for good. So instead of seeing, has the child passed or have they failed? Well, actually, okay, what does that tell us? The child seems to have some difficulties with a non-word reading test. They seem to perhaps have some difficulties with underlying phonological skills, or of course, it could be something else as well. It could be many other reasons. But let's use that usefully to help us have a better understanding of how we can help the pupils we're working with. And I think finally we need to focus, as I mentioned before, not just on age-related expectations, but instead of what's most important to our children and young people. And I think about the older pupils that I work with and that we work with as a service in secondary schools, thinking not just about the GCSEs, but or the qualifications that they're undertaking, but what are their hopes pre-16? Absolutely crucial. What does the pupil want to do? Where do they want to be going? What's important to them? And helping make sure that the pupils have the skills and the qualifications they need to be able to get there. And to me, that's what it's about. That's where I feel we need to have our focus on and where we need to be heading. Thank you. So I've covered quite a bit there, but I didn't cover the funding bit.
No, don't worry. Panel number 2, I'm afraid we're out of time. And I know that we still had so much more that we could have shared. But if you've got anything else you want to put in the chat, please do. But Julia, Kelly, Tricia and Alison, that was so interesting. Thank you very much. And do stay on for our final panel. You're most welcome. And once again, thank you everybody for everything you're putting into the chat. It's really, really valuable. So we're going to move on to our final section where we'll discuss the SEND review and the main areas of concern. And I'm going to hand over to Jo Hutchinson, who's the Director for Social Mobility and Vulnerable Learners Education Policy Institute.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm joining you this morning to talk a little bit about what's happening in schools policy currently that might affect children with dyslexia and children with special educational needs and disabilities. So there are two big developments at the moment in the policy world. The first is the schools white paper, which has already been mentioned, will lead to an education bill in the next parliament. And the second is the Send Green paper. So for those of you not as familiar with all these white and green papers and what they mean, the white paper essentially means that the changes are closer to legislation, more specific and more ready to be put into action, whereas the green paper is an earlier stage of development of the government's policy, just to help you navigate the terminology there. So what were the three big ideas from the white paper, just to set the sort of background scene to everything that goes on in the Send Green paper? So in the white paper, the government talks about this ambition of having 90% of children reaching literacy and numeracy standards. We've already heard some comment on that, and I'll mention it some more after I've done a quick rundown of what's happening in terms of my sort of analysis of what it all means and where the challenges are. So the second thing is that the government wants interventions to be made available to children if they fall off trajectory to meet that 90% meeting the literacy and numeracy standards, and that those interventions shouldn't have to depend on having a diagnosis, whether it be dyslexia or any other kind of SEND. And the third thing, which a lot of the sort of content of the bill will be about, is wanting all remaining schools to join a multi-academy trust in order to really tidy up a system that has become split across two different kinds of governance, which sometimes make it quite complicated to for the government to actually regulate schools. So all schools joining a multi-academy trust. And again, I will come back to that in a moment, just to talk about what I think it might mean in terms of children with special needs and dyslexia. So just moving to the green paper briefly, the three big ideas there. The biggest one of all is really that it's aiming to establish one national framework of standards, instead of the current situation where essentially we have 152 local systems and they're hugely varied. They differ a lot from local authority to local authority. And that's where we get the kind of postcode lottery problems of children who live down the road from each other experiencing very different outcomes in terms of being able to access assessments and support in school for their needs. So in order to generate that one national framework, the government is proposing to codify what parents can expect from schools and local authorities. So that's a really sort of big task there, because we're talking about dyslexia today. There are obviously many different kinds of special educational needs and disabilities, but the government plans to set out in each case what can be expected if your child has a particular kind of need or difficulty. And thirdly, there's a really important strand in this. It's about raising the level of provision in mainstream schools. So really hoping to increase the level of complexity of special needs and difficulties that mainstream schools are able to handle without having to consider moving children into special schools or alternative provision. How will those national standards be delivered? Well, the DfE is proposing to bring all the planning and accountability in-house to a new group within the department that would be called the DfE Regions Group. So a lot of it would be controlled centrally from sanctuary buildings in the Department for Education. They're proposing to regulate schools through new statutory academy trust standards. So this is part of the white paper. But what they're setting out by proposing that all schools join a multi-academy trust is then that all schools will be held to some standards, which will include standards around inclusion of children with special educational needs and disabilities. So wanting to be able to more strongly regulate that schools are including all pupils properly within their both in terms of admissions and in terms of how they support those children. And thirdly, they're planning to boost the SENDCO and early years practitioner training as part of how they see they will achieve these changes. So that links back to some of the discussions we've been having about teacher training that go actually quite a lot further in terms of thinking about what could be done. So that's a very brief overview of what's been proposed. I'm now going to, again, very briefly touch on a few of the big challenges that we see with that and how it might pan out in reality. So the first one is really around that 90% target. What we tend to see is that if you set unrealistic targets, one of two things happens to them. Either everyone soon forgets about them and we all move on, or they tend sometimes to drive the exclusion of children or the pushing of children into more specialist placements because mainstream schools know they can't meet those targets in 90% of cases. So another big challenge is that interventions require additional staff training and resources, as we've all been discussing. And so saying that they're going to be made available for every child who drops off trajectory, that's a really big claim to make. And we haven't yet seen the detail about actually how is that going to be resourced by schools and within schools. And there's also a challenge around the fact that my own research on special needs shows that primary schools in multi-academy trusts are much less likely on average to identify children as having SEND. So there's that tension there where the government's looking to set these new standards that, yes, we want all schools in multi-academy trusts, but we also want multi-academy trusts to be more inclusive than they currently are. So some further challenges with the Green Paper. It's obviously a really big and contested task to codify and band every different type of special educational needs and disabilities. We've talked this morning about some of the controversies around defining and diagnosing dyslexia. Similar issues exist around a lot of different types of needs. So that won't be a simple task at all. And getting buy-in from the system to that is not going to be easy. But what it will mean is that for each type of need, the government's going to set out and decide what it thinks should happen, both in terms of assessment and in terms of support, and right down to banding levels of funding that should be available for supporting different kinds of needs. So one of the things that I think is a bit missing from the Green Paper is the importance of personal, social and emotional development. There's a lot more focus on learning difficulty, literacy, numeracy, but it doesn't do as much to recognise the key role of how children either separately and independently may have social and emotional difficulties, or that actually struggling within a system that's not recognising and supporting them may in many cases cause those difficulties and exacerbate those difficulties. So there's a really big question for schools and for the school system. Will schools implement reasonable adjustments? And will they implement reasonable adjustments for all children where those potentially might clash with their behaviour policies or their standard curriculum offer? So the differentiation that we've heard talked about this morning, that's a really big challenge for a lot of schools, particularly under financial constraints. And we've heard a bit about the really big skills challenge there is in the teacher workforce. So even something as specific as a child having phonological difficulties can have many different underpinning causes that are embedded in that rich knowledge of child development that we're saying we'd like there to be more of in teacher training. But the reality is, if you look at our teacher workforce internationally and sort of benchmark it a bit, our teachers are relatively inexperienced because of that high turnover that's been mentioned. And also few of them, compared with other jurisdictions, have master's degrees, which is where that really deep knowledge around child development tends to be more easily expanded and developed. And there are currently no plans that have been announced as part of the white paper or green paper that would affect the core requirements for ITT or for the early careers framework. So that's yet to be tackled within these policy changes. So the final challenge I'll quickly mention is the cost neutrality challenge. There's a bit of an assumption of cost neutrality around the Send Green paper, which I personally find fairly unrealistic. When we think about early intervention for children with dyslexia or any kind of learning difficulty or need, we're talking about reception classes at the latest, really, aren't we? Early years ideally, but in the worst case scenario, when the children join reception class. And our reception classes are another thing where we're a bit of an international outlier. Because we start formal education younger than most other countries, we put children aged 4 to 5 into class sizes that are much bigger than they are in that age range in a lot of other countries. And that means every teacher's got more children, more different needs, more diversity that they need to tackle. Another problem with the cost neutrality, there's implications in terms of things like children's and adolescents' mental health support, and that the current plans for that from the NHS only cover part of the country. So without the support of NHS services in some cases, how will the reforms succeed? And also, how will this new national plan result in new provision where there are gaps in local provision, where we have local authorities that don't have specific services that are well fitted to all of the range of needs that children have, where there potentially aren't schools with specialist places that meet all needs. So it's really hard to imagine it being cost neutral while at the same time resulting in there being a consistent and equal access to all forms of support right across the country, because we know that's not where we're starting from now. So I'll stop there so we can get on to some questions.
Jo, thank you. That's really fascinating. And I think it's kind of really brought together quite a lot of what we've been raising as concerns and putting out as ideas for solutions. But to pick out those key points in that paper, that's really fantastic. Thank you. Such a benefit. So we've got 2 pre-submitted questions. The first one is from Angela Fawcett, Emeritus Professor, Swansea University. Angela's with us today. And her question is, changes in rules on levels of maths and English required are going to discriminate against potential dyslexic university students. How can this be addressed?
So this is in reference to the proposed minimum entry requirements for university. And it's not quite yet clear exactly what those will be, but the proposals include having to get a pass grade or a GCSE grade 4, as it's currently called, in English and maths, and potentially having to get 2 E grades at level 3 or A level as an alternative to that. And I think there are 2 ways that proposal could be adapted to make it more inclusive. The first route would be to say, well, we have a group of young people who exam boards have designated as requiring special access arrangements for exams. So we could say potentially a lower grade is required in those circumstances, or potentially an exemption from the requirement altogether is required in those circumstances. That would be one route of contextualizing those requirements to make them more disability friendly. Another potential way of doing it would be to step back, as mentioned previously, and look at the content of those exams and say, how attached are we, or should we be really, to this concept of having marks set aside for spelling, punctuation and grammar. In the modern world, how important is that, given that most people are doing jobs using technology rather than handwriting things and reading handwritten information. So I think there's 2 potential routes there. It's not clear the government's looking to do either of them, but those are the kinds of things that one might suggest or push for.
Angela, would you like to add anything or say anything?
There we are. Hello, everyone. Yes, thanks for answering that question. I think one of the key things is that at the moment we probably have the best university system in the world for helping dyslexic students. And if they're then debarred from coming through, I feel very passionately that that's going to be a really retrograde step. So my own son is dyslexic, as many know. I was a mature student. And for many people coming into universities, you're coming in from a different background than the traditional university entrance. And I really just don't want to see us going backwards, because I feel for much of dyslexia, that's what we're actually doing. BDA have been tremendous over the years, but we're now being set back by too much rigidity within the system. I'm
personally not keen on the idea of the minimum entry requirement either. It seems to be potentially regressive in a number of ways.
It's not just the dyslexic kids, it's the children who come from a low educational background previously, low input perhaps at home. Their language may not be as good, but they may have so much potential that we're not able to actually access because they don't necessarily have the vocabulary to explain themselves, and they may not have the basics of things like punctuation and spelling, but they have the ideas and they have the creativity, and we're going to miss out so much if we cut off that creativity, wherever it comes from. I feel absolutely passionate about that. And of course about the early screening, because everyone knows that that's the way forward, to identify problems, risk factors early on, so that we can put in place something which can support those children. So many key issues coming through here. Fantastic session, everybody. Really, really impressed. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Angela, thank you very much for coming and giving your input. As always, it's so valuable. I wonder if it's worth opening up to the floor, as we've got Joe here, and it's fantastic, Joe, that we have got you. Has anybody got any questions that they would like to ask Joe? G. Smith has said, I'd like to know about logical thinking tests and reports. I'm not sure if it's putting you on the spot too much, Joe, because it's kind of, just putting out questions.
I'm not sure I'm going to be the best person to answer on that, because it sounds like something a bit more specific to assessment for dyslexia.
Can I say something?
Yes, by all means.
Hello?
Hello, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I feel that there are so many disparities and inequalities, and also the fact that representation is also important. I feel that from where I have had early intervention, I have done a degree, I have gone to college, and my outcome, I'm happy to be alive, I'm very grateful, but I have struggled, and I am the worst person to be getting out credit cards, all those kind of things. I would like to get back into the schools and see what's happening, because I've been on a teacher training course, introduction, and it was just 2 weeks of, I was told, for neurodivergence training. And I was appalled by it, because then it means that awareness, 2 weeks is not enough. We are becoming more of assistive software society in the Western world, which is great. But I mean, if you're looking for inequality, you need to be making it a lot wider. The research needs to be a little bit more, I don't know, it just needs to be a lot more case studies. It just feels very one-sided at the moment from what I'm hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate what you've shared with us, and I think it is important, and Tricia's highlighted that importance of that pre-learning on our initial teacher training as well. I just wanted to ask Joe really about, this whole clustering of multi-academies, and you've raised some of the challenges within it. Do you think that there's a role there for specialists working across those academies?
Yeah, I think part of what the government is hoping for in the direction of travel in this area has been that they're hoping that as part of multi-academy trusts, those trusts might choose to develop their own specialist provision, so potentially their own special schools and their own alternative provision, and to support growth in those sectors in that way. And that, I think, is the government's preferred way of providing new specialist provision. We know special schools are very heavily oversubscribed currently. They're full to bursting, but the government prefers that new provision is grown in that particular way.
Thank you, Jo. We have actually got to the end of our session this morning. As Angela said, it's just been so fantastic to hear everybody's views, and Jo, to have your input on the green and white paper is really valuable to us, because you've explained it in a way which I can understand, and I bet everybody else is thinking that saved them the huge reading job of trying to work out what those papers are communicating. So I just wanted to thank everybody very much for coming to today's Dyslexia Commission session on reducing inequalities. I'm sorry if we haven't been able to cover all of your points, but we are going to collect everything from the chat and work through it and produce a report which will go out. We have a researcher team, and they're going to contact people to gather points and case studies which are coming in. And we are really keen to hear your examples of best practice. And I know some of you have been putting that into the chat, and also policy recommendations that you may have. And we'd be really grateful if you could submit these. If you've got any other questions or thoughts for the Commission, do get in touch, and you can email in to info@chamberuk.com. So once again, thank you very much, everybody. Sadly, this session has come to an end. Thank you, panellists. Thank you for all your expertise.